Thank you, Sonia. I haven't done anything yet. So, thank you. So, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. My name is Joëlle Vitiello, and Hi. Okay. My name is Joëlle Vitiello, and I teach in the Department of French and Francophone Studies, and my pronouns are she, her, hers in English. Welcome or welcome back to students, staff, faculty, members of the community, and parents. Welcome to the second day of the 2022 International Roundtable. So far, it has been a wonderful event with 5 of the student-led sessions that have been absolutely superb and so well attended. So let's give a round of applause to our student leaders. After this 4th plenary session, there are 2 more student-led sessions that I encourage you to attend. Content Creation as Decolonization, an African Perspective, taking place in Davis Court, Markham Hall at 1:10, and Decolonization in Total Island and Palestine and the Role of Jewish Resistance in the Harmon Room in the library, also at 1:10. At 2:20, we will be back in the auditorium for the roundtable plenary session with our 4 plenary speakers. I'm now going to introduce our 4th plenary speaker, Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies. Carole Boyce-Davies is the Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters and Professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell University. She's the author of a prize-winning Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, published in 2008. Black Women, Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subject, published in 1994. Caribbean Spaces, Escape Routes from Twilight Zones, from 2013. And a bilingual children's story, Walking an Avon, from 2016-2017 in Haitian Kreyol and English. In addition to over 100 essays, articles, and book chapters, Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies has also published 13 critical editions on African Diaspora, and Caribbean literature and culture, such as the 2-volume collection of critical and creative writing, Moving Beyond Boundaries, International Dimensions of Black Women's Writing, Volume 1, Black Women's Diasporas, Volume 2, the 3-volume Encyclopedia of African Diaspora, from Oxford, and Claudia Jones Beyond Containment, Autobiographical Reflections, Poetry, and Essays, and Pan-African Connections from 2021. Her forthcoming book is titled Black Women's Rights, Leadership, and the Circularities of Power. It's published by Rowman Littlefield, Lexington Books, and it's just come out this September, I believe. Her popular essays and reviews have appeared in The Guardian in London, The Washington Post, The Crisis, Ms. Magazine, Ithaca Journal, The Black Scholar, Miami Herald, Trinidad Express, Trinidad Guardian, Caribbean Today, Caribbean Contact, and Newsweek. In addition, Dr. Boyce-Davies has been the president of the African Literature Studies and of the Caribbean Studies, and when she presided this last association in 2016, she took the whole membership of the association for their annual conference to Haiti, the first Black republic, that is also the first country to self-liberate from colonialism and slavery, an important gesture and action. And one of the keynote speakers was Angela Davis. So let's give Dr. Boyce-Davies a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Joelle. McAllister, how are y'all doing? You gotta have more energy than that. I know it snowed and all that, but still. Anyway, I am really pleased to be here. Oh, you have something I need. I'm pleased to be here for a couple of reasons. One is that the framework that this, can you hear me? Yeah, the video audio person. Yeah, one of the reasons is that the structure of this event, the McAllister Forum, is really an admirable one because it allows students to engage the conversation, the faculty, and then guest speakers, and I'm really happy about that. Also, for somebody like me, it provided an opportunity to engage people doing really interesting work, such as Adam Khalil last night, How to Commit Crimes Against Reality. I learn a lot each time. I'm one of those people who define herself as a perpetual learner, so for me, this is a learning experience. Also, definitely yesterday for Marisa Ruiz-Trejo's work, Decolonize and Depatriarchalize. I love that conjunction. Knowledge through women and feminist thinkers from Chiapas and Central America. And I'm sad I missed the first one because I taught a class Wednesday evening, a graduate class on decolonial feminisms, and could not, of course, leave that class because it's a long, once-a-week class. So anyway, my pleasure. I want to say thank you to Provost Lisa Anderson-Levy for coming. Pleasure meeting you, Provost. And last night I was happy to meet your president, Sue Rivera. So that's also quite a nice aspect. So a shout out as well to Joel and Jeremy for inviting me and for your work in terms of making my presence here actually happen. They know my long journey yesterday. Ithaca is an impossible place to travel from, you know, right? It's like really, and we've even had following the pandemic and the ways that transportation was affected, air transportation was affected, even a lessening of the availability of certain kinds of flights. So now there are only 2 carriers out of Ithaca. So I'm happy that I was able to make the connections. Anyway, my talk today, the semi-colony, decolonizing gaps, knowledge and reparatory justice, right? The semi-colony, decolonizing gaps, knowledge and reparatory justice. Basically, what I'm trying to do is find language, right? So it's a quest for finding language to describe our current realities. That's all that it is. And I invite you to think with me as we try to do that and see if what I propose makes sense. So if you think it's not a good idea, then I won't ever do it again. but I'm trying. Okay. So basically, one of the first things for the abstract, the argument is that decolonial gaps, the more I look at it, it's like they appear everywhere, in every field, in every geographical location, in a range of relationships and institutional contexts. And what are these gaps between the full practice of colonialism, you know, the full-blown colonialism where you have them running everything and managing every aspect of your life, culture, education, religion, the whole thing, right? And then the acquisition of a limited emancipatory experience in most of those locations. So this is what I'm looking at. All of these, I would argue, maintain a kind of semi-colonial status with their former colonizers. While the British colonial project and its unresolved issues have been an easy and visible target, there are several other angles through which we can examine how these decolonial gaps operate and how knowledge can do reparative justice work, which is what this group is doing clearly, right? So an analysis of the semi-colony for me provides additional nuances as we consider the decolonial project in the humanities, which is what I'm working out of. Okay, so that's, if you have to leave early, Provost, you got the whole talk. I know you do. Provosts are very busy people. Anyway, so introduction. You all are so amazing that you invited me back, because sometimes you go somewhere and they may never invite you back. But I was here before in the same forum. So I was fortunate a number of years ago, then as a relatively young scholar, to be invited to the McAllister Forum, to be one of a select group of scholars, which included the famous Edward Said of Columbia University. In his talk, Said addressed the role of the intellectual as part of an ongoing contribution he would make to the topic. And I was telling people yesterday, Said was like, he was doing chemo at the time, he was very ill, so his mobility was very limited. And I think, Joel, we were saying that they had to find a way for him to sit on the stage on a high stool or something of the sort. But I do remember feeling in awe of him and really pleased to be invited to be part of a forum that included somebody like Said. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that this material that he presented is available to you, so you should go back and look at it. So in his talk, he addressed the role of the intellectual as part of an ongoing contribution he would make to the topic. In an essay entitled, in an essay entitled The Limits of the Artistic Imagination and the Secular Intellectual, he provided 6 axes of activity and thought for the secular intellectual, which I cite in my own work subsequently in a chapter titled Recovering the Radical Black Female Subject. In other words, I'm suggesting that that discussion that he had informed a lot of what I would do subsequently in some other work, because he had laid out a particular pathway for the intellectual. And this discussion I mentioned of recovering the radical black female subject is in the Claudia Jones book, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. And what does he say the intellectual needs to be doing, the secular intellectual, which is a whole other conversation we can have about who the intellectual is, those items there, that we should be providing counter-information in an age where the media have the resources to manage and manipulate reality, that we should too provide an reinterpretive function at the level of communicating ideas. 3, a demystification by articulating the basic issues of justice and human good or evil surrounding these issues. Interfering, number 4, and intervening across lines of specialization that attempt to privatize knowledge. 5, an insurgent and resistant position when consensus is arrived on the basis of domination. And 6, the task of exercising a moral function of deploying the irreconcilable and irreducible oppositions between ideas, people, societies, histories, and claims at the level of performance. So it seems like a lot, but basically he's saying that unless the intellectual is involved in some sort of transformational knowledge-producing practice, they're really endorsing the structures that already exist in the society. And he's not the only person that would say that. Sylvia Wynter would make a similar argument, and she would take it further, suggesting that it is we, the intellectuals, who really hold down the structures of the state and reproduce them and send more students out into the world with that framework in which they participate in a world as it is without challenging the status quo. So in Sam Said, then, a public intellectual of Palestinian origin, the intellectual has a responsibility towards creating fully decolonized units. This is how I would summarize it and interpret it. So mindful of your theme this year, I want to work in this presentation with this latter position of the question of creating decolonized units from the angle of the humanities, which is where I work from, which all turns still, the humanities that is, on the assumptions of the structures, histories, timelines, all of that of the European bourgeois white male subject. So I felt as well that I could not return to McAllister in this context without recalling and thereby continuing that earlier conversation. So my talk today will cover 3 basic themes: the modern semi-colony, which I invite you to help me think through, as I said, the whole question of decolonizing knowledge, and then thirdly, reparative justice, knowledge, and the humanities. So the modern semi-colony. I was always taken by Caribbean poets Kamau Brathwaite's poem called Negus from his book, The Arrivants, which if you haven't read, you may want to look it up. And in it, he struggles in that poem with a kind of mode of articulation. And what he does in the poem is have the structure capture, and I was happy yesterday that Marissa made the point about poetry also carrying forward that sort of theoretical knowledge. He tried to capture poetically in the poem a certain stuttering, you know, that difficulty you have when you're trying to say something important and you can't get it out fully. He captures that in the poem, that whole weight that one feels in the inability to release the full content of a powerful declaration. This powerful declaration then, decolonial in its struggle, captures the incompleteness of emancipation and or independence. And at its core, it presented the struggle to name the residual effects of colonialism and therefore the ongoing coloniality of the Caribbean, which we see today, with some countries politically independent, some countries republics, several still colonies. And that's the point that we kept trying to say in the onslaught of post-coloniality, that it was too premature, that it silenced too many problems. So the question of decoloniality and a discussion like this one, as you know, reopens that discussion. So at least those people who are still dealing and struggling with colonization, active colonization, not even the semi-version, can still have a place in which to have their issues brought forward, right? So this powerful declaration in this text then captures that struggle, I want to say. And what does it do? He struggles with this ongoing coloniality in the Caribbean and then tries to find a way to land it, right? And he does it through a certain repetition, the stammer which he captures in the it is not enough to be free of the red, white, and blue, of the drag of the dragon. And that's Kamau Brathwaite, who we lost sadly a few years ago. And I did a blog on him. If you go to my website, you will find a whole discussion with this image as well. 1930 to 2020. So he struggles with this declaration, which when he finally lands it, it's really interesting the way he goes with it, right? It is not enough to be able to fly to Miami, structure skyscrapers, excavate the moon, scaped seashore sands to build hotels, casinos, sepulchres. It is not. I must be given words, he says finally, as the poet struggling with this language. I must be given words to shape my name to the syllables of trees. I must be given words to refashion futures like a healer's hand. Right? Like a healer's hand. So he tries in many ways then to echo some of the struggles that he has. And then when he lands it, he goes with a question of how to refashion language, how to refashion thought, how to get to the words that would let him be what he wants to be. He struggles, and I think, with this whole question of the kingdom of the word, which he echoes, I would say, from Alejo Carpentier's The Kingdom of This World, which, as if you read my class, my Caribbean Worlds class is reading it now. And the Carpentier book actually struggles, and looking at it now, struggles with the same issues that still confront Haiti. The incompleteness of the Haitian Revolution that really never took, and the mistakes that were made at the very beginning, which then affect the whole future, right? So he struggles with that incompleteness of the Haitian Revolution. And I've looked at that struggle, that deferral of the full completeness of the Haitian Revolution, and sort of typifying the Black experience in many ways, and not just the African diaspora context, but the entire context, that there's a constant deferral then, which revolution tried to get to but never really achieves. So the poem, as you can see, develops and moves through a series of negations in its ongoing critique of that incompleteness, from flag independence to the whips of enslavement, the pestilence associated with the life of the enslaved, and the looming vulnerability generated by climate fallout, an assessment of the access to means of modern mobility, right, for a few, and the creation for and service to tourists, visitors, which the Caribbean is known for, and which include also the deformation of the landscape. That point about earlier, right, about structuring skyscrapers, excavating the moon, scaped seashores, sands to build hotels, casinos, sepulchres. So then he goes to, of course, I must be given words to shape my name to the syllables of trees. I must be given words to refashion futures like a healer's hand. And finally, to the key verse then that drives the thematic aspect of this presentation, it is not. It is not. It is not enough to be paused, to be whole, to be void, to be silent, to be semi-colon, to be semi-colony, right? And that was the part that intrigued me for so many years, and I never wrote about it until now. So there are several places we can linger, of course, for this poetic masterpiece. But for me, refashioning futures is salient, as well for its link to the idea of decoloniality, with its demand for a world free of these continuing exploitations and dominance. Stronger than a comma, but not as definite as a period or full stop. Those of you who are teaching language can sympathize. The pain of undergraduate writing instructors and students, the semicolon plays that intermediary role all the time, joining clauses, separating lists of ideas, bridging between independent clauses, according to most grammarians. But the irony then is extending it, I would suggest, with that Y to the colony, which gives us the semi-colony, right, function, which in many ways then captures our current reality of not knowing, right, not quite having a full stop to ending colonialism, which lingers as a troubling pause, also an interruption, does not ever fulfill its intended end. And for me, that's what he was trying to work through with the semi-colony. Interestingly, the early analyses of this poem as captured by Caribbean neo-colonial critiques, such as Eddie Boe and in a special issue of Journal of West Indian Literature, focused on the quality of the poem, made fun of the stammer as poem. One scholar suggested a paragraph, he said. Maybe he said you could just say, it's not enough to have constitutional independence if we remain culturally and economically dependent upon colonial and neo-colonial sources. And if independence means despoiling the landscape and dispossessing the peasantry. That's Ken Ramchand's summary. And he thought he was like making fun of the poem by just saying we can actually just see that instead of having a whole poem to do that. And then for Eddie Boe, who had written that essay, he said the whole poem has to be read as a kind of ritualistic rereading, and that we get to the meaning each time you read it because that repetition does it and so on, magnificently increasing and providing rhythm which allows the meaning to unfold. He says then the experience of reading, it will also be a process of discovering the meaning. We must at the same time read as if the meaning is given and so on. So it's in two positions, right? The one from Ramchand, which is saying, well, we could just translate this and say this in regular language. And the other one saying that the poem itself is doing a sort of ritual mounting of the argument, right? Interesting, I think, but still limited readings of it. Of course, much has happened, though, in terms of the breadth, politics, and intent of performance poetry since this limited analysis some 20 years ago. As indeed, since then, rather than being an outlier, Kamau Brathwaite has created now standard rhythmic tropes, alliteration, reverberating echoes, code switching, and fracturing of the language of standard English, deliberately redeploying the quote-unquote broken English insult with its play on words, but also capturing the colonial dislocation and disruption of its subjects as they also attempted to re-territorialize the language. And in other words, that creative theoretical use of poetry that he mastered. So the translation into theoretical language, while meant as a kind of put down of the writer's skill, is precisely where the poet has an advantage, as he is able then to concisely, in poetic form, indicate what scholars will take a whole paper to write about. And this becomes one of its desired outcomes. In this context, then, we can never lose sight of the creative theoretical innovations that will come out Brathwaite's. So Ramchand's translation is precisely the poet's concern of finding the right words, which lead directly into his plea to have words that would refashion futures, to speak, to create, then, to transform, which in the end is what independence was supposed to be doing, and indeed what the writer does with words. So while for years then I remained intrigued with the linguistic, aesthetic, stylistic nuances of this poem, the sublimated rage then, the move to using Vodou, Antroit, Atimon Legba, and all the ways that the poem was constructed, what also lingered for me was the theoretically incomplete semi-colony idea. I moved through multiple theorizings then of the post-colonial, including Achille Mbembe's post-colony, but found his own construction of the post-colony a very masculinized place. And if you read his piece, you will see that's exactly what goes on. There's really no place where women exist in that post-colony. I addressed this, as I said earlier, in earlier work, such as Migrations of the Subject, in a chapter called From Post-Coloniality to Uprising Textualities. But above all, Mbembe's post-colony proved my point, which was published in 1992, proved my point that actually the post-colony is actually a semi-colony, which was in what I suggested in subsequent work, particularly the Half the World, which I'll connect as we move forward. So my recent work has sought to address this history and trajectory of half the world discourses, all of which use a sort of mathematical formulation of semi-ness seeing women and black people as always the unrepresented portion of the fully emancipated world as well. I also began to see that the semi-colony is also one in which half of the population is not fully represented, thus returning us to an earlier assertion by Claudia Jones via Half the World column. My conclusion, we remain a semi-colony if women's labor is still colonized, triply or multiply exploited. Relatedly, semi as a prefix means half, as in semicircle, but also means almost, or partially, or incompletely. And central to black women's emancipatory politics in the early 20th century, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, poet, short story activist, is quoted as saying, quote, "I know that no nation can gain its full measure of enlightenment and happiness if one half of it is free and the other half is fettered." So the implications of this framing is significant, as it can refer also to racial subordination as gender subordination simultaneously. Thus, a necessary theoretical detour came as well via Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he had argued that the 20th century marks the turning point from that old-style capitalism to the new domination of capital in general, which he identifies as finance capital, and that was more global in form then, the move from that limited version to a global imperial model. He continued, "The epoch of the latest stage of capitalism shows us that certain relations between capitalist associations grew based on the economic divisions of the world, while parallel to it and in connection with it, certain relations grew up between political alliances between states on the basis of their territorial division of the world, of the struggle for colonies, of the struggle for spheres of influence." And then he goes on to use the language of the semi-colony. Since we are assured then via this analysis and others which I've returned to, such as Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And what I'm suggesting is that many of those texts that we read and discarded or left aside have to be returned to really try to unpack this question if we really want to do it justice. So Nkrumah had looked at and argued with Lenin that colonialism is essentially an economic enterprise, and that it's global, and that it's imperial. So therefore, if we work with that model, not so much the state-managed colonialism where they, do education and so on, but look at and culture and all of the ways in which colonialism worked. But if we look at that, the economic structure as really the primary vector of it, then it gives us a whole other way of looking at decoloniality then as a colonial formation that challenges that structure. So thus, in his critique of imperialism, we have the language of the semi-colony, which suggests that there are different forms or versions of the semi-colony, since we know that the economic basis of colonialism following Fanon generated a range of practices, psychological, cultural, behavioral, educational, and so on, and we're able to attempt a wider reading of this notion of the semi-colony as the incomplete, partial, or unfinished project of decolonization. So how are we to define the semi-colony? We can say provisionally that it is a politically independent nation, institution, condition, which used to be a full-fledged political entity, but now runs its state of affairs with a local neocolonial structure in place, which still replicates to the extreme the remaining cultural and economic structures of that prior colonial arrangement. We can see it in marriage, we can see it in university life, in government, in state. And I'm suggesting that different ways then in which we see the semi-colonial practice operating, where one moves then from that domination to another version which still continues after with all of that, all of those earlier practices still in place. A surprisingly good example, and you all are gonna follow this really well, of this at the macro level was on full display recently in the United States handling of the passing of Queen Elizabeth, which transmitted in minute detail all of the structures of empire, the pomp, the pageantry, which is the hallmark of allegiance and practice of loyalty to a former colonizer. So while the US is more like the son or daughter of Dracula for many of us, in some formations with practices more lethal than the parent, it nonetheless operates as a cultural colony in relation to the United Kingdom. This was a mind blower. This happened just last month. Another enduring example is the ubiquity of English departments, which may probably be the most significant sign at the academic level that we maintain a colonial structure in the university. These are all remaining colonial institutions. The centerpiece of the humanities is the English department, meant to initiate students into a hierarchy of literary knowledge, Western culture, and its dominance. English departments have tended to be linked to the advancement, maintenance, and acceptance of the culture of the British Empire in their structure, everywhere in the world, Provost. This is the structure, but they are intact and in place and left to operate just as the statues one sees in various locations operate. English departments do the same thing. So students are initiated into a respect for this empire, the British Empire, and all of its productions, its history, and all of its knights and so on. So this is what you saw when you looked at the Queen's funeral. Repeated all day by the media, right? So by all the very nature then of that production, to me, captures the US in a strange way as a kind of semi-colony to the British at the cultural level, if nothing else. But here's even a more practical, popular, and y'all are going to hate me for this example. The presence of two of the royal family members in the United States, demanding that their titles be used here. I don't know if people are noting that, which in other ways maintains the framework, the transference of the colonial machinery back to the United States. Keep in mind that those titles, like Prince of Wales or Duchess of Sussex, while kind of cutely dressed up with nice fashion and so on, these are representative feudal and colonial ownership of certain areas of England, of these polities. So when I went to Wales, people were there anxious to indicate to me that they were not willing British subjects, but colonized by Britain, as the Irish have doggedly resisted for years. In the Caribbean of my childhood, and before independence, I was at that cusp just when we got independence, a great deal of land was referred to as crown land. And it was just seen as normal, meaning owned by the royal family, and that continues today in those places like Jamaica, which have not gone to republic status. So in an essay I wrote on the British-American relation to the British in ways, on British-American racial colonialism, the Meghan Markle and Harry exit, I concluded the following, that even as it is a global hegemon, the United States still operates in a cultural colonial relation to the British in ways that most of the Caribbean have long abandoned, having recognized and experienced the extractive nature of British colonialism. So the United States, while it's fought for its freedom, did not have such a long encounter with colonialism, and as a result still maintains a distinct adoration of things British, from accents to academic departments called English, and definitely also the high-level consuming of news related to the royal family in its various machinations. Harry, in my view then, still remains the royal, modern or updated version, dancing with Jamaican girls during his state visit there, and I had an image, really nice image of it. Yeah. One back. Yeah. Right? So I wasn't surprised when he married Meghan. Yeah, dancing with Jamaican girls during his state visit there. Still his presence in the United States meant that the post-colonial version of the United States now has a member of the royal family operating at the height of its social structure, with all that means, and demands in terms of protocol, press security status, and so on. I see the prince then as a modern member of the royal family, as ensuring the connections with the United States are maintained. Indeed, there's now a US branch of the royal family in place. A neo semi-imperial colony, maybe we can call it that, I don't know. I must be given words then to shape my name to the syllables of trees. I must be given words to refashion futures like a healer's hand. Number 2, decolonizing knowledge. Let me go back then. Yeah, not surprisingly, once I started thinking about decolonial gaps, they began to appear everywhere, in every field, in every geographical location, in a range of relationships and institutional contexts. So two elements are indicated here. One, that decolonization of the continent itself, and by extension of the Caribbean and other formalized colonized areas, had been arrested or halted. And two, therein remained a range of continuing colonizations in a range of fields, in my particular study of literature in that example as well. In the introduction to Decolonizing, the Academy 2003, an intellectual project developed to place African diaspora studies as one of the major vectors of the unfinished decolonizing process, I asserted that the Academy, meaning the university and its larger knowledge production apparatus, is perhaps one of the most colonized of spaces. In every discipline, one is confronted with a production of knowledge that assumes European epistemologies, ideas, timelines, and the defining frameworks for intellectual work. This thereby creates a hierarchy of knowledge in which African people's experiences still remain at the bottom or outside of consideration in the same measure as our Black lives still today. In Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in Decolonizing the Mind, 1982-1986, centralized the issue that literature is still being written in colonial languages, but his assertion on colonialism is worth repeating here. The real aim of colonialism was to control the people's wealth, what they produced, how they produced it, and how it was distributed. To control, in other words, the entire realm of the language of real life. Colonialism imposed its control of the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent dictatorship, but its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world, page 16. Definitely there was an arrested decolonization in the Caribbean and Africa. I was in South Africa, for example, a few years ago, where they were just changing street names, many of those names in statutory representations. Sometimes the people who worked against the freedom still remain, and in the Caribbean, they're still there. So if you walk down some of the main streets, they're still named after pirates and colonizers and slave masters and so on. A task force was recently created in Trinidad, and they asked me to be on that task force to look at how changing those names should happen. So this is what I meant about arrested. We didn't even complete all of that. Many of the statues are still there, the names are still there, the structures are still there. That's what I meant about that unfinished process. So much of this was arrested, we are saying. And arrested by whom? Neo-colonial state operators acting often on behalf of Western governmental and other international business interests. So the settler-colonial relations, as presented last night brilliantly by Khalil, provides another clear angle of studying how this structural relationship still exists in terms of internal semi-coloniality. So this is one really obvious example that one could always go back to and look at it in practice right now. So essentially then, what we try to do at Cornell, and I worked with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's son Makoma, was to try to recreate the structure of the department, and we were successful, I was explaining last night, in changing it to Department of Literatures in English as opposed to Department of English. So the point is that, according to Makoma, even the structure of African literature, and that's continuing that whole semi-colonial relationship, that the structure of what became African literature, think about Achebe, those of you who know the field of African literature, and others, was still located within a colonial context. And he cites the Makerere Conference, which was titled Literature of African Writers in English Expression. So it locked in a very specific, he would argue, structure of English into what would become African literature, even though you already had prior versions of African literatures in traditional languages, right? South Africa, Yoruba, and so on. So and Phyllis Wheatley is a good example of that. And one of my colleagues named Larry, a poet, she always adds Phyllis Wheatley, not her name, right? Technically, according to Makoma, she should be at the start, if we want to really have a new scheme of looking at African literature, she should be at the start of that tradition, really, not so? Because Phyllis Wheatley is born in Senegambia and then migrates here via slavery. and then is, placed in the weekly household and so on. But she's already a poet, as you can tell from her work, and is, at such a young age becomes who she was, right? So basically, what we do get is that a different structuring or understanding that already assumes all of that colonial practices. So all of those colonial practices. So as members then of one of the departments which historically maintained that entrenched imperial British white supremacist framing, Makoma and I, with a group of faculty members, proposed a change of name to Departments of Literatures and English, which was also assumed with a kind of change to the redistribution of courses that were available. In other words, moving away from overwhelming students with having to take all that 18th century literature to giving them space then to take other literatures in English, which then we were able to do. And students were really appreciative of that because they were like, so they didn't mind taking one course and all those nights and so on. So Gawain and those guys, which you have to study, but really to really want to study some more contemporary work as well and understand what's going on in the rest of the world. So the student responses were amazingly supportive because it reduced the pre-18th century English courses that they should take and instead created courses that study literature of the Americas, for example. And they could go pre-18th century with that as well if we really opened it up, that's so, and other forms of literature. So the faculty responses were overwhelmingly favorable, and we were pleased that in a department which included a vibrant body of subjects of inquiry, not captured by other current namings, a series of discussions happened to challenge ourselves in our context, which resulted in a document then, which by affirmation our colleagues moved to create a more just and equitable department. We asserted then that a move to the Department of Literatures would present a more accurate description of the wider range of literatures that we teach and study already, open the department to a wider pool of students who see English as limiting their study with us. It leaves us already always explaining that an English department does more than teach English, but does literary studies, and then move beyond the privileging of English rather than literatures as the field primary descriptor. That's what we did. So we saw this move then as while being first among the major universities in the United States. Keep in mind the African universities did that, had to struggle with that, led by Ngugi and others back then. And also the Caribbean universities did the same thing. So this is what I mean about the US still maintaining those structures. So the decolonial projects had been moving forward in different locations, but haven't really touched the United States because of those assumptions already built into the process. University of Brasilia, where I did a Fulbright a few years ago, had created something called Department of Literary Theory and Literatures, both in the early 1990s. This formal change then was among the first in the United States. And since then, Bryn Mawr did it as well. And basically, I was telling somebody last night that all it takes is actually faculty saying they want to do this. That's all it takes, but most people don't because they don't even raise it as an issue. So others who have followed this model indicate that the basis of their change was also wanting to demonstrate, quote, their commitment to decolonial approaches to literary studies. The point then about the coloniality of knowledge as defined by Anibal Quijano is that the United States had instituted a new form of colonialism in its relationships with Latin America. And I would extend this as well to the internally colonized communities like the Black community, the indigenous peoples communities, and so on. Basically then, the expansion of Western capitalism, according to that line of thought, implied the expansion of Western epistemologies with all of their ramifications from the instrumental reason that went along with capitalism to the theories of the state and so on. And this is a really good point that Walter Mignolo makes in the geopolitics of knowledge and the colonial difference. And there's this link between the two, the epistemological and, of course, the economic as well. So basically, we can see that the modern world system, which is located at the beginning of the 15th century with the coming of Columbus and so on, then created a whole other pattern of relationships which continues today. Quijano theorizes this as the coloniality of power. So never having had the British form of colonialism and gaining independence many years before the Anglophone Caribbean, the U.S. relationships with Latin America, we argue, got to be negotiated directly between the U.S. and the former colonizing powers. And therein you have that nexus taking place. Additionally, what is often not erased, which is often not clear to many people and is often erased, is that the US and Europe continue to have existing colonies in the Caribbean, and that indigenous people existing in a colonial relationship with the US state and US African Americans continue to function as internally colonized semi-colonies. The colonial relationships with Puerto Rico, for example, and the Virgin Islands, as you saw during the last hurricanes, are pretty clear. You only see them, I think, when there are major crises, and it's like suddenly, wow, these are colonies still of the United States. And that thing, remember, of Trump throwing the paper at the people and so on, and saying he didn't know that water separated them and all of this. But for many of us in the Caribbean, looking on at this, it was like, finally, there's a space for people to see vividly what people have been talking about. So basically, several visible colonial gaps, decolonial gaps, appear right away. The British colonial project and its unresolved issues, the absence of reparations of the exploited labor, the US economic backyarding involvement of the Caribbean for sure, the settler colonial destruction of indigenous peoples, the economic abandonment of the Caribbean except for pleasure and or exploitation of its resources and people and so on. And for the Caribbean, it's so stark, and this is what underlines the reparatory justice claims, that basically when the British left, first of all, they didn't give anything seriously. They just used, extracted, and then when they left poor roads, often just one road leading to where they wanted to take products in and out from. No schools, just a few schools for the elite. So those new governments like Trinidad and so on, Jamaica, had to create numerous schools just to begin a process of educating the population. Had to really build roads, had to do everything without the resources to do it. And this is what is driving Caribbean reparatory justice arguments so far. Thus, we know that we can follow, the questions of coloniality as outlined. And for students, it's easy to Maldonado Torres's outline of 10 theses of coloniality and decoloniality. Very easy to find. But basically what he argues is that it's easy to see them as the naturalization of war, and you're in that process now, in spite of the fact that it seems like it's a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's actually a US war. The media never tells you this, but it's a US proxy war taking place. Have you studied how many billions of dollars went from the US there? But the population in the US is meant to just accept all of that as if they're just giving Ukraine money to fight a war, but it's a whole US proxy war taking place. So the naturalization of war, the naturalization of extermination, expropriation, and domination, and exploitation and death, the transformation of power, knowledge, and being under coloniality, and then the decolonial turn away from modernity and coloniality, the need for continued questioning, the erotic, aesthetic, spiritual decolonial turn, and so on. And I like it because it's an easy way to understand some of that discussion. But the point for me is that what one finds is that an ongoing process then of how to move beyond all of that. In my own work, and I love, this is my new book and the new cover, isn't it great? It's called Black Women's Rights, Leadership, and the Circularities of Power. It's not out yet. It's going to come out, they said on the 15th, which is, oh, wow. Yeah, it's supposed to come out tomorrow. But this piece of art is from Wange Shimutu, the seated. She did 4 pieces of women in power and those representations, and she gave me permission to use a detail from one of them. But basically, an early understanding by Sylvia Wynter, which she calls Unsettling the Coloniality of Power, Truth, Freedom, is one of my favorites, because there she argues that struggles of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and so on, struggles for the environment are all part of a systematic pattern to claim our humanity in the face of Western bourgeois ethnic class man, which claims humanity for itself and therefore leaves us always constantly having to reassert our humanity. That's the point that she makes there. And I liked her early essay on this, earlier essay where she talks about the humanities as really being central to all of that. She argues there that even as the humanities function as a breakthrough in the production of knowledge outside of the authority of theocracy, it also reinstituted a new order of man in which with the rise of modernity created another category of people whose epistemologies are not worth considering, right? Still, therefore, in the university context, for me, and this is another bold statement to make, I was telling the president that last night, the humanities functions almost as a colony to STEM. What do you think? Right? And that's how I want to see it. The ongoing argument from Winter then is that basically the Western bourgeois conception of the human constantly replays all of these models, right? So 3, finally, reparative justice, knowledge, and the humanities, which is what I want to close off with. So I agree with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's prime assertion of an early abolitionist discourse and decolonizing the mind. The classic project of Ngugi is called On the Abolition of the English Department, which actually uses the language of abolition. And we always struck by that he does this in 1968. I was told that Ngugi had come here already. But basically, Ngugi says that the whole world needs decolonization. And I have it somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. He says the whole world needs decolonization because in so many ways, the modern world was formed by forces of economics, political, and cultural colonialism. The colonizer and the colonized were affected in different ways by the colonial process. We have to work for a decolonized world. So basically, he is really bringing us still to that arrested decolonization argument, not so? And for us in the Caribbean, and I really want to make sure that this is part of our discussion, that the reparative justice claims that are asserted by CARICOM, the Caribbean community, led by Hilary Beckles, is a really advanced version of talking about reparatory justice because it's not about transferring money at all, but it's how do we repair all of the processes that we have had that have affected us and that still affect our communities. They ask still for a full formal apology, repatriation as possible, Indigenous Peoples Development Program, and it's one of the first to really talk about that in the Caribbean because the assumption when people talk about the Caribbean is that the indigenous people have all disappeared or been wiped out, but there are many communities in other places which have sometimes created integrated relationships with other communities so that they're not as visibly, physically as they were before, but they're there. Places like St. Vincent, if you drive through St. Vincent, right where you had that earthquake recently, after you get to a certain point, it's indigenous communities and there's signs that mark the way and so on. So Indigenous Peoples Development Program, cultural institutions, definitely they stress the public health crisis. And for Beckles and the studies that they have done, a lot of Caribbean health conditions have arisen coming out of enslavement and all of the other subordinations that we've had in the past and still exist. Eradication of illiteracy, an African knowledge program, psychological rehabilitation, you know, we still need that. I mean, think Kanye West, need that. Psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, and definitely debt cancellation. Why? And Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, is really good on that they're sort of paying off the debt which Haiti had to do to pay for its own independence, lasted for so many years that it affected their ability to develop their own internal developmental structures and so on. And then, of course, the debt, who do we still owe them after they extracted so much from this? It's an amazing kind of assault on the mind to think that we still have to do that kind of work. Anyway, for me, the specific claim of number 7, illiteracy eradication, African Knowledge Program, is where we can go with this, right? Because we hasten to assert right away that here is one of the many areas of reparative justice that we could actually do ourselves as academics, which is where I started. While we recognize that several of these reparative justice claims, like debt cancellation, require government intervention, reparations clearly cannot assume that it is only a government-to-people process or the stereotypical handouts. Instead, a series of reparative steps to reverse the conditions in which African peoples globally still find themselves must come from multiple directions. So what is under our control is knowledge. We in the institution that produces knowledge. Though often still a site of contestation, institutional academic context in which we work is the knowledge production area. The epistemic, therefore, is within our reach. So I want to linger then on that knowledge question here, as it is the center of what we can do in this kind of discussion. Under the category of knowledge, then, we can talk about building knowledge networks, which is what they suggest for community rehabilitation. So it's significant, I want to suggest then, back to that Ngugi paper, that they actually use the question of the abolition of the English department. Abolition discourses on the abolition of the English department, and the whole question of reclaiming these unfinished decolonizations. And Ngugi, in a subsequent discussion I had with him, talks about seeing this whole question, the rise of decolonial studies, in this piece that I have here, in South Africa, also in India, but even in Britain, the call for decolonizing English department from students in major universities and so on. And he talked about them publishing something with him. So for me then, the intellectual community becomes complicit to the extent that recent scholarship around race, gender, sexuality remain outside of their frames of knowledge acquisition. We can therefore conclude that the ideas of a certain acceptance of the status quo are built into the academic enterprise if these ideas are not challenged. In other words, the academy becomes complicit and continues to function as it has in the past as the site of the production of a privileged reading and understanding of society. Since the university as it exists today maintained the same colonial structures it inherited, whether in the US, the Caribbean, Africa, and so on, they maintain a semi-colonial status, is my argument. As we operate now in the academy, new and continuing questions need to emerge that can be brought forward for subsequent deliberation, which is some of what the students are doing, I gather, in your project here. How to ensure that all students are exposed to a range of knowledges as they make their way through the institution. How to restructure and move out of that order of knowledge in which a series of other humans and the work they have produced, their epistemologies and ontological systems remain outside of the frames of importance in the larger institutional context. For this scholar then, updating Edward Said, with whom I began, it is significant to pursue these understandings in the process of advancing knowledge while there still remains an incomplete knowledge acquisition process. The continued epistemic violence then on our students, unless we are able to account for missing areas of study, how does a university respond to its community's needs? The space that decolonizing of the humanities offers then can occupy as an active and energetic space. As we move beyond the colonial university, we can begin to imagine and create the decolonial university from within. We navigate always between, on the one hand, a past of dignity and legendary greatness, and on the other, the starkness of the initial history of dispossession, economic difficulty, brought on sometimes by horrendous leadership, often in collusion with external actors, environment, climate, location, and so on. But through it all, there remains an amazing resistance of people matched by an outstanding creativity. We live with a series of conflicting representations, but above all, at the core of it, an unrelenting humanity, which is at the core of human relationships that are positive. From what it takes to survive in the harshest conditions, to how one begins again after everything falls apart, to how one lives a life full of beauty and joy in spite of institutional and state attempts at continued subordination. So therefore, for me, there is a coda of possibilities, right? And I would suggest, hopefully you all would do it, making sure that names have been changed from departments of English or Romance languages and literatures in major African universities to departments of literatures, making African and African diaspora writers central to university curricula, and establishing a healthy and reciprocal relationship between a variety of literary traditions. I'm not saying privileging one, but creating some sort of synergy. Engaging theory in a decolonial context as it comes out of a range of experiences, Africa, Latin America, Afro-US, the Caribbean. Identifying salient theoreticians in critically relevant fields and not assuming all Europeans are owners of theory. Offering means of transforming knowledge from many different fields and angles that includes full representation of all contributors, men and women, and others in between. Thank you for inviting me back to the McAllister Forum. Questions? I don't know if you want to. Okay.
We have time for about 20 minutes of questions. So we have two microphones that should work, and so you can come to the microphone and ask your questions. And yeah, please come to the microphones.
I was trying to see if I missed any really slides that I should have shown. Yeah.
It was a wonderful talk. I really appreciated it. Helped open my mind to all kinds of new things. But I was curious, what does psychological rehabilitation mean or look like on your, I think it was number 8 on your list?
Right, of the CARICOM. This is actually from the CARICOM reparative justice claims. And what they're suggesting is that although it doesn't seem like it on the surface, the effects of colonialism and enslavement and all of these structures have left people with a great deal of psychological problems that then manifest themselves. For example, the Fanonian self-hate. They're still, and Fanon is probably one of the last people to really go into that you still have people who carry that self-hate in terms of how they look, in terms of everybody trying to be blonde. If you look at all of the representations of popular singers and media, everybody's blonde. And I'm happy that people are going to purple and green here and so on, especially the Jamaican track stars and runners. I mean, when they're running, it's purple, green. It sort of complicates it, and I'm not saying that people don't have choice to do whatever they want. I mean, we have that space. But it's sort of perpetual manifestation of a certain representation. Beyonce doesn't look like that. She's made up to look like that. And then when you go to Senegal, you meet young women with bleaching, blonding. They want to look like that. They have hair that they're buying from everywhere in the world so that they can walk down the street looking like that. So there was in the new Museum of Black Civilization, somebody did an installation using bleaching products, and they put all the bleaching products on a blue tarp. Do you know by the end of that week, people had taken them? So it does not leave out other countries of the world. West Africa, there are billboards when you drive around, which show the question, the whole question of bleaching. So psychological rehabilitation to me has to be about a state, I don't know, it would be difficult to say the state is going to do because they can't and they don't, but some sort of process whereby people are thinking about ways that we can bring ourselves back to accepting the beauty that we have without really trying to transform it into something else. And the suggestion is that's just one area, that there are many other areas in which we need, all of us, some ways in which we can really counter the sort of onslaught of these horrible images that we have on a day-to-day basis. Thank you for that question. Anybody else? Doesn't have to be a question, it can be a suggestion. Or you could say, I like the paper as it is. You don't have to, I'm still really struggling with that semi-colony. I'd love to hear my brother Khalil say what he thinks about it as an option. Because to me, it's something that I thought sort of stayed there, that nobody really opened up, and I'd like to at least look at it as a possibility. Yes?
No, I loved the whole talk, but also I agree, being able to keep theorizing around the semi-colony. But I guess a question that I have is related, coming more out of critical university studies. And so thinking about the university as being able to have influence, have epistemic influence, right? But folks like Roderick Ferguson, who kind of look at the development of these, what have become the marginalized departments and programs that you're naming, that kind of speak to the university's ability to appropriate and the ability to take in these knowledge systems and keep them marginalized. It's probably still the semi-colony, right? But I guess I'm wondering, how do we work within universities' ability to control, to continue to maintain control over these? So, for instance, we rename or about to abolish the English department, but you know, I have like some good friends in English, but I knew the point's very much appreciated. But how, like, to rename that, but then the structure still maintains, right? That the credentialization, the meritocracy, the individualism, the preparation to be either, you know, capitalist subjects or capitalists in that sense, right? How do we grapple with that?
Right. But interestingly, after the George Floyd murder, and then the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, which became international, happened everywhere, right? You saw them in England, taking down statues and so on. The university that I belong to had actually put out restructuring of the curriculum, and they did quite a bit of that. So the work, it takes a bit of work, and it's not impossible, it's all doable, it's just that nobody does it. Because people tend to just, in the academy, want to do their work and be left alone, sort of. But to me, there still has to be some sort of a process in place which allows that to be an ongoing. And it's not easy to be done in just a short amount of time, but it's a process that will have to be continuous and has to be looked at and monitored. Now, the problem with Black studies, and I'm in a department which was one of the originators of Africana studies, right, is that it often remains marginalized from the larger institutional apparatus, and deliberately so. But sometimes within those departments, you also have structures already which create that installed end. And it's hard to explain it without really going into a lot of internal detail. But basically, in the Cornell example, and I can say this because I've written about it, and so you can check and read it. In the Cornell example, what was built in was an absence of women from leadership. So as much as we like Turner and so on, women were never part of the framing of the department. So essentially in the 50 years that it's been there, there's been no woman director of Africana studies. And to me, you're not suggesting that having a woman is automatically going to make it a better place, but suggesting that it doesn't even open up that possibility of what can happen, and then you lock in there in a certain kind of pattern of operation. It also didn't create a kind of succession network where you can bring in young scholars and so on. So this logic of how to do that doesn't happen. So this is why I always go back to Sylvia Winter's piece on that, on how we mistook the map for the territory. She says that Black studies, even though it came in with the idea of sort of being a transformational space, end up accepting all the terms of the institution. For example, they tell young scholars, don't do anything, stay underground and just get tenure for the 7 years that you're there. Meanwhile, those 7 years pass, and those people, once they get tenure, they're kind of used to that position. They're not going to really do anything. They don't have to. So essentially, it's a different model than when I came into the academy, where study and struggle were part of the normal way that you conducted your lives. And then the senior scholars protected you. I still look back at things that I did, like, how did I get away with doing that? But because the senior scholars knew, and they knew what was going on. And I remember I had really challenged some senior professors in Latin American studies in my department. And the guy wrote to my chair then, Okpewo, who is sadly passed recently, and said that my behavior in that context was disruptive, whatever he said. And my chair wrote him back one sentence. Professor Boyce-Davies is a very important member of our faculty, and whatever she has done in your department, we are sure that it was about certain kind of whatever. And that's all he wrote. So the ways in which, therefore, the young scholars who come in are supported and are able to do that kind of work without feeling that they're going to lose, you know, their place in getting tenure, being victimized, is really central to all of that. So I'm suggesting those are just examples, a series of ways then in which the Black studies and other units have to maintain that logic of insurgency, which the research shows worked. This is how we end up getting those departments, because people protested. So what happens once you get them? Do you still sort of just accept the institutional behavior and then, you know, accept that this is how you're going to be, or do you still be transformational? It's difficult, but it's a hard way to go, but it's a way.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I'm James Robinson. I am an alumni of this prestigious institution as well as a faculty member at one of the neighboring schools.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, I appreciate it. I'd like you to go a little bit more in depth in talking about sort of the colonial model as applied to Black Americans. Because back in the 60s, that was a argument that was made that had sort of two different takes on it. And I'm wondering if you can expound on how you view Black Americans as fitting in the colonial model or the internal colonial model. But I also want to just co-sign on the whole point of English departments. I know that some of us had the way of calling those departments lily white departments because all the faculty in them have always been white, or the majority of the faculty. And I don't know if, I know it was that way when I was a student here. I don't know if it's that way now. But I know at many universities when I'm looking at job opportunities and I see who's in African American studies and you look at who's in the English department and there's no one of color there.
Wow,
So,
still.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really shocking. On that, the last part of your question, really important to study that. I think what happened, if we use the Cornell example, was that the departments opened up and you were able to get more courses in different and diverse areas of study, but the structure never changed. So if the structure doesn't change, then you still end up with the same thing. So they don't mind hiring one African to teach the whole continent, which is what Makoba complains about. You have one African scholar for continent, and then you will have them struggling to get 3 or 4 different people teaching medieval or something. So there's an imbalance then in how you're going to have one person teaching South Africa, West Africa, East, so many things are left out, and students again are shortchanged in terms of not getting the full breadth of what should be available. And then if you happen to get a Caribbean course, which you may not, because you may not have anybody qualified to do it, and hopefully if they're not qualified, you don't want them doing it either. So, no, because I've had people call me and said, I want to teach a Caribbean course, can you tell me what books to put in? Like, really? You need to study it and really get attend the conferences or whatever and get a good sense of how to teach it rather than just trying to add, something that you don't know about. But usually it's coming from a place of goodness, so they want to do something, but they don't know how. So then there has to be a mechanism to do it. But if there's no structure to do it in the department, then it's not going to happen. Right, so the internal colony is it's an old argument, as you were saying, and actually I have a really nice piece from Claudia Jones, who I did work on. Next one. In which it's called Self-Determination and the Black Belt, in which she really works on that internal colonization model. But it's a position that has had circulation in many different people. People like Malcolm X asserted it. Every now and then you have a version of it where people like the group that did the petition We Charge Genocide, where they went to the United Nations, is another example. So you have in many different, particularly in the international legal areas, attempts where people need to go beyond what is happening in the US nation state to look at remedies outside of it. And they're activated usually, but they're never really consistent. So it's a structure that's kind of loosely there and a theory that hasn't really been fleshed out fully, but actually represents the way that Black communities still operate in relation to the state. In terms of voting is a good example, where you have deliberate mechanisms to take away voting from Black people, which are so obviously current in different states around in the United States context. So the logic of it is there, but the way of really putting theoretical flesh in it via political science, via international law, hasn't really happened fully enough to really make it something that you can run with. But you see samples of it, you see mechanisms of it operating, particularly around the geographies that have to do with oppression. As for example, following Hurricane Katrina, there was a big one where people said, well, what happened? In the Katrina case, the Cuban government actually, which has experience in terms of sending doctors to work with communities, wanted to do it, but of course they couldn't get in to do any kind of work with people internally. So there's the dominance then of that the state structure really affects possibilities, and we see it operating repeatedly. And to me, there are a lot of gaps in how the U.S. is run that they will have to attend to following the Trumpian machinations, which still, each time people see it, they're like really surprised that it happens. But essentially, there are a lot of gaps, the way the Supreme Court is run now and so on, which need to be attended to. But in all of that, Black people either have a choice of either participating in the integrationist way or finding other kinds of ways to operate communities independent of all of those structures. I'm saying, I guess, in some that there's ideological work that has been done in that area. There's some legal work, but there's not enough of a way of really fleshing it out fully so that it has the kind of mobility that it needs if it's going to work. One more question here.
Appreciate you. Honored to be here with you. My name's Walter Grayson. I'm the chair of the history department here.
Oh, wow. Nice.
So
Perfect.
And history has to do so much of the work as a profession that you've described already. My particular question is about art, visual art and music as sources of inspiration in this. And I love the pieces that you had that draw out of literature and the way it fuels or can fuel decolonial struggle. Could you talk a little bit about sources that you know or would recommend that come from music or graphic art or the arts generally, theater and dance?
Wow. I mean, I have to, that's a great question, but my brother last night is probably more qualified to talk about that than I do. But it's something that I learned from as well, and I learned from the arts always. But I find it, for me, I did a whole course, and my students did a conference called the Creative Theoretical. And I like it as a model because it suggests that theory doesn't really come only from the wordings of theoretical language, but it also comes from a number of other sources, and those sources include visual, they include poetry, they include literature, they include a range of other things. But I have many things that I work with, but I don't know how to give you more examples than the ones that I have.
Maybe we can just continue the conversation.
I know, but I thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yes. Any more? Or comments? Yeah.
Thank you so very much for this talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate a bit more on this very provocative and interesting point that I think is just fantastic. Humanities as a semi-colony of STEM. I'd really just like to hear more of your
What are
of
you
your thoughts on
thinking?
this. I'm not sure myself, so that's why I'm asking you.
Well, you know, it came to me because in most institutions, and I was saying this to the president last night, that I learned from a candidate for the Dean of Arts and Sciences that Cornell's population of students, 27% are humanities and the rest are STEM fields. And basically from all of the institutions in which we operate, the ways of getting funding and all of that, the money aspect of it comes through the STEM fields. This is where corporations give money and so on. So in other words, the humanities ends up being sort of a subsidiary to all of that, and therefore depends then on the goodwill of certain institutions if the presidents and provosts and so on understand what the importance is of really educating students in the larger context. So for me, the humanities end up being sort of at the mercy then of these fields. That's all I'm saying. And therefore if you end up having a provost or a dean who is a scientist, then generally you're in a bad place. Yeah, because they may give you something small, but they really don't care about that. So for example, we had a dean, the Asian American Studies department had one faculty member at Cornell for many years. And the students themselves were asking the dean, for 2 hires. And she said, well, I really can't help you because I have so many other requests from STEM fields where they're bringing money and so on, and therefore, I remember the students actually got up and walked out of the meeting because they felt it was going nowhere, because she felt that she had no wherewithal to get them anything because the STEM fields needed and were asking for more hires than she had the ability to give out, so she privileged them instead. So therefore, there's a weightedness, I think, in terms of who gets what, and often the STEM fields, I think, are able to acquire more resources from the funders and corporations and business interests and so on, and that's often what drives it. So, but somebody needs to study that. That's something I just said. I'm hoping that somebody really studies how that works. A lot of what I'm saying is, I'm trying to find ways to look at what structures our current realities and to see what happens. And hopefully they will be taken further by a range of other people like you who are thinking beyond that. Thank you.